There are several categories of games in terms of players. There's co-op games, such as Planet Apocalypse or 8-Bit Attack. These are games in which all the players are on the same side, facing against an unnatural universe. In theory, you could play any co-op game solo, or I suppose vice versa, but you're all on the same side, so really it's a one-sided game. Then we have games that have two sides, such as Invasion of the Brood or Axis and Allies. Now, these are often just two-player, but if there's a lot to do like Axis and Allies, you might have multiple players on each side. Now, there's some games that are sort of in between, like my own game of Orcs Must Die, the board game. You can either play a co-op against an unthinking universe, or you could have two teams, each of which is partly facing the universe and partly facing the enemies. These are zero-sum games, because there's just two sides in a two-sided game. Any advantage that I get in a two-sided game is bad for you if you're on the other side, and any weakness I show is good for you. This is also true of the so-called co-op games, because these are really two-sided too. It's just that there's no one being the other side. But any advantage you get over the universe is good for you, any disadvantage is bad. Thus, there is an innate tendency for games with two sides to snowball and keep going. Let me give you a particular famous example of this. In 1973, the game CA was published. It's about surface naval combat in the Pacific in World War II. To me, this is an interesting topic. So I bought a copy. Then I played a few games. So here is the deal with CA. When you shoot at an enemy ship, you roll a die to see if you hit. There's various modifiers and results telling you what happened. You might get an engine hit or a weapons hit or so forth. But if you get an engine hit, the enemy ship is either slowed or dead in the water, and then it is basically helpless for the rest of the scenario. It's just a sitting duck for torpedoes and whatever you want to do with it. But here's the rub. Any random hit could knock out the ship's engine and power. So here you are, moving your ships, getting ready to cross the enemy T, lining up the best shot, and suddenly your rotten little brother rolls a 6, and lo and behold, your battleship, the South Dakota, is dead in the water. Yes, you can keep playing, but now you basically don't have the South Dakota as the battle moves away. That leaves a big hole in your battle line, so they have an advantage. Then, because they have advantage, they knock out your cruiser, the New Orleans. Yeah, you can shoot back, maybe you score hitting one of his ships, but you haven't really caught up. And every time you lose a ship, it gets worse and worse, and you just get steamrollered. And then you sit there staring at your ships, or at the lack of ships on the map, and you wonder how America ever beat the Imperial Japanese. In fact, one reviewer pointed out you can play CA without a map. Just each of you take turns rolling a die. First one to roll a 6 wins. No need for all the rest of that. So this is the nightmare for a two-player game. If one player gets a big victory, then is the game over? Do you still have to play it out? My son, Lincoln, who is a great designer, he hilariously has a tendency sometimes, if he gets an early defeat in a game, to say, the game, I can't win, I can't come back. This is especially famous because on numerous occasions he has had a defeat in the early game, say in Cthulhu Wars or Hyperspace, and then he has come back to win and was like, so Lincoln, too bad you were knocked out early in the game, and he kind of was rueful about it. So, but there's other people that are like this too. Now, there's ways to address this snowball thing. One is for the game to have a comeback mechanic. For instance, let's talk about Axis and Allies comeback mechanic. Now, the way they work it is kind of baked into the game with that the Allies have way more production total, but the Axis have more initial troops and weapons and stuff. So the way the game works is it starts off the Axis always is on the offensive and they're trying to conquer. And as they conquer, the Allies are producing stuff and trying to hold them off and producing more stuff, and they're on the defensive. And eventually the game kind of is balanced so that just about the time the Axis has conquered enough stuff to be equal to the Allies in production, it's run out of extra material, so the game is balanced. Another way to balance a game, which Axis and Ally also use to an extent, but other games too, is to have the defensive be somewhat more powerful than the attack. So if I start winning, then the defender ends up getting advantages. Let me give you an example in my game World, in a game World in Flames of World War II. As you start beating the Germans, you invade in Normandy and you move through France and you get closer to Berlin from the Russian side. Well, what happens is that the Germans, your supply and production is further and further from the front line, and the German production of supply is closer and closer, so it can get troops to the front line faster. It's able to react faster. It can move troops around between the fronts, and so it gets these natural advantages, which kind of don't fully make up for the fact it's losing the war, but they give it a way of delaying and maybe getting the comeback. Now, there's another way to stop this snowball effect, and that is to have the game be multiplayer instead of just two-player or two sides. For example, my most famous modern game is Cthulhu Wars. Now, it's, 3 to now 12 players. Now, in a multiplayer game, when someone gets too far ahead, the other players all tend to gang up on the lead and pull him back. That's not all of them at once necessarily. This is quite a different experience from a team game or a two-player game. Now, it can be carried to an extreme. In some games, the lead getting yanked back happens so much and so strongly that the game actually finds it hard to come to a real end because the guy in front is always being pulled back. Now, Cthulhu Wars solves this with the Doom track. And basically, the Doom track sets a timer onto the game. If a player surges strong early in the game, then they actually get more Doom. Then the players can knock them back down, and they get less Doom. But they've already got that little edge. And then someone else goes to the forefront. He gets more Doom. They piggy on the middle of that guy, pull him back a little bit. And usually in Cthulhu Wars, it's not everyone jumping on the lead player. It's like one or two guys will jump. Someone else will be doing just his own stuff. Another guy maybe will be helping the guy who was behind trying to curve. It just depends, right? So, but the Doom track keeps incrementing and it never really goes down. So the game is going to end, and that's just like a timer. So that's real simple, basic stuff, but if you're not familiar with how multiplayer or team games or that stuff works, that lets you know. And I'm going to end with a tale about how to win some of these games. A rueful tale. So there was a game called Origins of World War II. I really liked this game back in 1971 and 72. I haven't really played it since. The most glorious victory we ever had in it was by my buddy Chris, who was playing France. So in the game, if you have 20 or more points, you're doing pretty good. I think 25 is like the max you could ever had. So Chris, like 2 turns before the end, and Chris was not a gamer. There was a bunch of us that were heavy-duty gamers, and we were all focused on the game. Chris was playing just to make us happy, so we have 5 players. So Chris added up his points, and he realized that he was probably in the lead, and then for the last 2 turns said, oh, well, I can't win. And then he went over to the piano and played the piano, except when it was his turn, he'd come back, make some, I guess I'll do this because it might be worth some points. And the rest of us, remember, we're only teenagers, so we're not very experienced. We ignored him and focused on each other. Every once in a while, we'd throw a few scraps to Chris if we had no one else to get it. We'd add everyone else's points up obsessively. You have 21 points, you have 18 points, except we didn't add Chris's points up because he couldn't win. Then the game ended, and we added up the points. Chris not only won, he basically conquered France, and this was as the Third Republic of France before World War II, which is quite the challenge. So we were all teenagers. Nowadays, I'd like to think we'd be more critical of the ploy. Now, I'm not saying that the way to win all multiplayer games is to pretend you're going to lose, but I will say that every time I play a multiplayer game, someone points out how they're going to lose. And this is, it actually leads into a meta game where a player will say, well, yes, I'm in the lead now, but you guys are going to gang up on me, and then I got to the lead too early, so I'm going to be pulled back too far, so really, I'm behind, I'm losing, while he sits there with 10 Doom points on the rest of us. So it becomes this iterative thing, but that leads to the diplomacy and the interaction. And really, I play games for the fun of that interaction and that discussion. So there you are. A little bit of sandy philosophy about these multiplayer games. Thanks for listening.